I have just a small declaration to make before I introduce Andrew Thacker's keynote lecture. Because Amy and Jennifer know that we started working on this conference about 3 years ago and had to go through some hardship to make it happen. So I wanted to thank them for staying on the project and in fact organizing 3 conferences rather than 1. And I'd like to have a special thanks to Benoît Tadier, the new president of SEM, because he took that conference and ran with it when all of it should have been sorted out long before he took charge. So he was just thrown into the deep end of the swimming pool straight away. And thank you, most of all, to all of you for remaining faithful to your commitment to give papers and to give lectures. This is why I'm especially pleased, happy, and honored to welcome Andrew Thacker for the plenary lecture that we had invited him to do some time ago. Andrew is a professor of 20th century literature at Nottingham Trent University. He is the author or editor of several books on modernism, including the 3 volumes of the Oxford Critical and Cultural History of Modernist magazines, which was published from 2009 to 2013, and most recently, Modernism, Space and the City, which was published in 2019. He was a founder member and first chair of the British Association for Modernist Studies. He is currently working on 2 projects, a cultural history of the modern bookshop and a new project on spaces of translation in European magazines, 1945-1965, which is co-funded by the British AHRC and the German DFG. I would like to add that Andrew has been a friend and a companion for a long time, ever since with Benoît Tadier we started our little group on small modernist magazines. So it's a very lovely occasion to hear you talk today, Andrew, about a love for the spirit of what is new on bookshops and other modernist structures.
Merci. Thank you, Hélène, very much. Thank you to the organisers. Je vous remercie pour l'invitation. So part, as Hélène said, this is part of the longer project that I'm doing on the cultural history of the modern bookshop. And one starting point was the work that I did on modernist magazines, because one day I started pondering in doing all that work as to where you would get one of these small magazines from. And then I noticed in a copy of one of them, and I can't remember which one it was, a list of the bookshops at which you could buy it. And I thought, okay, so that's the key here. The institution of the bookshop is one of the key structures in the dissemination of modernism. So kind of what I'm going to play with today in today's talk. So I want to start with the words of a Parisian bookseller in 1918 proclaiming the importance of the bookshop to modernism. What must be created, what must be assisted are the bookshop libraries that do not tend to satisfy a large public, but rather a group that it may be possible to know individually and to serve perfectly. It is truly indispensable that a house devoted to books be founded and directed conscientiously by someone who unites with an erudition that is as vast as possible, a love for the spirit of what is new, and who, without falling into the wrong-headedness of any kind of snobbery, is ready to assist the new truths and forms. Adrien Monnier, founder of La Maison des Amis de Livres and partner for many years of Sylvia Beach, founder of Shakespeare and Company, here offers a way into thinking about bookshops as modernist structures. For the bookshop as a modernist structure comprises, I want to suggest, three aspects. First, it is a physical entity, often with its own specific interior decor and structure. And I don't really have time to talk about that aspect of them today, but I do think it's very interesting, the look of a bookshop. But bookshops are also structures located in particular social spaces, often a city with a developed cultural infrastructure. Monier's shop, along with that of Beach and the later manifestation of Shakespeare and Company that I'm also going to consider in more detail later in the talk, inhabit the famed modernist geography of the Parisian left bank. And just have an image here of Monnier and Beach in Beach's bookshop. I think this is a lovely photo of the two of them, actually. Monnier's shop was a house devoted, in the French, consacré, to books and significantly to the concept of both selling them and lending them. But Monnier also referred to a bookshop as a true magic chamber, an image that gestures to something more than merely bricks and mortar. So the second aspect I want to consider today is the bookshop as a more abstract, more metaphysical modernist structure, suggested already, I think, by Monnier's semi-religious language of devotion. This is what Monnier calls the spirit of the new, those new truths and forms that, regardless of the problems of defining modernism, put those on one side, constitute, I think, an essential part of what, to borrow from Saussure, we might think of as la langue of modernism, the deep structure of the modern that impels innovation, experimentation, and the search for the new. Interestingly, Monnier here chimes with an essay by Virginia Woolf from 1916, quite an early essay by Woolf. This is an essay called Hours in the Library, when Woolf also called for new forms for our new sensations. And very interestingly, for my purposes, Woolf's essay contrasts the habits of older, learned, male readers of the classics with those of a younger generation of readers by means of a central image, that of the bookshop. So while the older generation visit antiquarian bookshops to, quote Woolf, drag home folios and quartos of Euripides and Voltaire, Woolf argues that the younger generation visit a different kind of enterprise, one infused with the spirit of Monnier's, with Monnier's spirit of the new, but perhaps lacking in old-style cultural capital. So here's the kind of quote from Woolf. Thus, to stand in a great bookshop crammed with books so new that their pages almost stick together, and the gilt on their back is still fresh, has an excitement no less delightful than the old excitement of the second-hand bookstore. It is not perhaps so exalted, so that's the cultural capital thing. But the old hunger to know what the immortals thought has given place to a far more tolerant curiosity to know what our own generation is thinking. What do living men and women feel? What do they love and hate? What do they see of the surrounding world? And what is the dream that fills the spaces of their active lives? They tell us all these things in their books. And I might add, where do we get these books? In the bookshop. Woolf here, of course, prefigures the later arguments that she makes, the more famous arguments about modernist fiction in the essays like Modern Fiction and Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. And we might say in all three essays, Woolf identifies something like an emergent structure of feeling, to use that term of Raymond Williams's, a structure that later became known as Anglo-European modernism. However, I think what is most fascinating in Woolf's essay is the role of the bookshop here as a physical location in which that more emerging dreams and visions of modernity can be found. So it is the bookshop serving both as a physical location and as the locus for a more abstract modernist structure of fresh forms and truths. Now, the third aspect of Monnier's quote that I wanted just to stress is the idea of community and the role of bookshops in fostering that and versions of social space. Monnier's bookshop libraries were imagined to serve perfectly a group rather than a mass public. But she wished to avoid the charge of elitism, or the word she uses in French is snobism. We should remember that the name of her bookshop was Les Amis, the Friends of Books, and thus not just the house of books, not just the empty maison de livres. Not merely a physical structure then, but a social space for readers to meet, to mingle, to form a group. This community of readers and people that met in the bookshop were not only those that bought the key works of French modernism, and if we look at the accounts, it's the key, a number of the key names, Apollinaire, Breton, Gide, and so on. So it's not only the stock and the people that visited it and were friends of it, but it was also members of her library, which by 1920 had about 600 subscribers. And here is, I hope you can see that, is just some of the rules for the subscribers to the library, both of Monnier's on the right, and the left is the one for Beech's bookshop. So both of them had libraries, and there's a very interesting digital humanities project that's been carried out at Princeton, which gives you access to the subscribers to Beech's bookshop, so you can see who borrowed what on what day. There's not one so far that I know of for Monnier's bookshop, but the archive, I think, is in Imec, so some of the material can be found there. Members for both bookshops included many young French intellectuals and other kind of key names that we can recognise. So Jacques Lacan, Simone de Beauvoir, Walter Benjamin were all subscribers to both libraries. The true business of a bookshop, Monnier declared, includes not only selling but lending. Since, she says, it's almost inconceivable that one can buy a work without being acquainted with it by initially borrowing it. Which I think is a lovely idea, that you just you need to check the goods out first before you buy it. It was a library in which, as one advert proclaimed, this is Monnier's bookshop, you could find, quote, all the moderns up to the extreme avant-garde and all the classics. So Monnier's bookshop, along with Beech's across the road in Rue de l'Odéon, also acted as a venue for many talks, lectures and exhibitions. And here we have just two examples of this. We get a flyer for a talk at La Maison des Amis by Valérie Larbaud, the famous French critic, on Joyce's Ulysses, published the next year, of course, by Beech. While on the right, we see T.S. Eliot giving a reading at Beech's bookshop in 1936. And another dimension, of course, is publishing. And while Beech, of course, famously published Ulysses and a few other items, Monnier's shop issued many more volumes, including poetry by Valéry Faure, Roman, translations of English texts, such as the first French Ulysses of 1929. They also produced a number of little magazines, such as these two, Le Navire d'Argent, the Silver Boat, and La Gazette des Amis de Livres, both of which were edited by Monnier. Monnier was much more of a kind of critic and a writer than Beech ever was on literature. Along with, and this is wonderful, there were two other magazines called Commerce and Measure, and it just so happens I went into a bookshop in Caen this morning and found a copy of Measure and a copy of Commerce. That is serendipity of the best sort, I think. Anyway, I was really delighted to find those. In Le Navire, for example, we find translations of Suevo, Hemingway, and Eliot. One of Eliot's very early translations into French occurs. Prufrock appears in Le Navire, translated by Beech and Monnier together. So as Joe Winning notes, here we see booksellers determined to create spaces, quote, in which modernist cultural production could flourish, developing sites of social gathering rather than straightforward commercial enterprises. Bookshops, therefore, are structures which are somewhat meaningless, we might say, without human interaction. Empty vessels turned into vibrant social spaces with the presence of readers, borrowers, and listeners. This is what Jean-Luc Nancy terms the commerce of thinking with books in a bookshop, the forming of a community in a particular social space. For Nancy, the bookshop is a place for commerce between people. And this is the little book that he did on the commerce of thinking, punning on commerce in two ways there. He says the bookshop is occupied by the passage from one to another, from authors to readers, from publishers to authors and to readers, from one author to another, from booksellers to books, and from books to readers. In such interactions, communities, that key concept for Nancy, are formed, and the true value, the valoir, appears. To be worth something is to count for someone other than oneself. And thinking counts essentially for the other, counts only for the other, by the other, and in the other. I find it quite uncanny when I was writing this that Nancy's words are actually prefigured by Monier's almost a century earlier, when in an essay she suggests that a bookseller must engage closely with her customers to develop a sense of community. And this is Monier's quote, and give them as much of yourself as possible, she says. In short, to live in them is to live more fully in oneself. So I think it's a really kind of nice parallel there. Another term that I just want to introduce that connects with the concept of community is that of the network. And we heard yesterday in Bonnie's wonderful meditation on the importance of networks in modernism. I think all bookshops are part of a network structure that stretches from author to bookseller to reader. And Robert Darnton, the book historian, talks about the communication circuit here. I think it's an interesting idea. Bookshops are not just physical structures, but nodes in a network with multiple edges. One could envisage a network diagram that radiates out from a bookshop via the books and magazines it sold, from the contributors to these texts to the readers who bought or borrowed them. But there's another network that we can plot, one which connects a number of key bookshops that emerged from the late 19th century onwards and form a kind of network structure for modernist publishing and dissemination. And this is my very, very primitive attempt compared to Bonnie's very exciting networks yesterday, to just plot some of these. And at this point, I thought I'd better stop because I had a lot of other stuff I needed to do. But just to kind of run through the bare bones of this network, Sylvia Beach in the centre here visited the London bookshops of Elkin Matthews and Harold Munro for advice before she started her bookshop. She also bought stock from them. Monier, of course, was her partner in life and in bookselling, provided a model for a bookshop with a library and the idea of stocking modernist work or modern literature. Francis Stelloff, founder of the Gotham Book Mart in New York, a really kind of fascinating bookshop, visited Beech's bookshop in the 1920s and corresponded with her over manuscripts and book sales for a huge period of time. And then finally, George Whitman and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, both in Paris as part of the GI Bill after the last war, met in Paris, visited bookshops, and eventually became both famous modern booksellers themselves. So it's not a static structure now, but a network that moves across time and space, commercial ventures, but also sites of the commerce of thinking in Nancy's terms. Many more nodes in this network could be added, but for the rest of this paper, I just want to consider the two Shakespeare and Company bookshops, and particularly I'm going to look at Whitman's later version, developing some ideas about modernist structures that I've outlined from Monier. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to just introduce one further concept, that of nostalgia. In its origins, nostalgia represents the theorization of space. It was a pseudo-Greek word invented in the 17th century by a Swiss doctor and referred to the algos, the pain of being away from home, and the intended desire to return to a particular location, the nostos, the return home. It was seen in the 17th century as a curable disease for which you were given leeches or stomach purgatives and opium, in addition, of course, to a physical return to the motherland, which is the more pleasant way of curing nostalgia, we might say. But it was only in the 20th century that nostalgia became marked primarily as a temporal term, noting a desire to return to some past time, wanting to go back to the good old days, we might say, rather than confront the bad new ones, to paraphrase Brecht. How then did modernism engage with nostalgia? Well, one dominant current within it clearly looked to break from the past. Think of the futurist slogans, destroy the cult of the past. While another tendency, the attitude perhaps of Eliot in The Wasteland, was to look backwards to past traditions as a way to look forward formally. Joyce in Ulysses, and of course today is Bloomsday, so I couldn't resist a little bit of Joyce, is a key modernist text for thinking about nostalgia in both these senses. Of the spatial sense of the nostos, of Bloom's peregrinations across the city, but also Joyce thinking of past novelistic conventions of Homer as a skeletal springboard to a new form of writing. The Lestrygonians episode of Ulysses utilises the art of architecture. So it's no surprise to find Leopold Bloom musing in a mood of nostalgia, both spatial and temporal, upon the ever-changing quality of urban structures. So just a little bit from this episode. Cityfall passing away, other cityfall coming, passing away too. Other coming on, passing on. House, lines of houses, streets, miles of pavement, piled up bricks, stones, changing hands, this owner, that. So I want to think a little bit about a house that changes hands from this owner to that. And that is to say, to think about a bookshop. The second Shakespeare and Company bookshop, an image there, in Paris was opened in 1951 by George Whitman. And in many ways, Whitman's post-war project appears a self-conscious revival of the structure on the other side, with an image of Joyce and Beach in the front of the shop. A kind of revival of the modernist bookshop pioneered by the first Shakespeare and Company. So I want to kind of now explore whether Whitman's bookshop represents a new and distinct form of post-war modernism, particularly as manifested in the promotion of three little magazines I'm going to mention. Or was his bookshop merely a nostalgic rebuilding of an earlier modernist structure in space and time? So to think further about nostalgia and bookshops, I want to draw upon a distinction introduced by Svetlana Boym in a book called The Future of Nostalgia, which is a tremendous book. Somebody recommended it to me not that long ago. And Boym distinguishes between two forms of nostalgia. Restorative nostalgia puts an emphasis on nostos and proposes to rebuild the lost home and patch up the memory gaps. Reflective nostalgia dwells in algia, in longing and loss, the imperfect processes of remembrance. The first category of nostalgics do not think of themselves as nostalgic. They believe their project is about truth. This kind of nostalgia characterises national and nationalist revivals all over the world, which engage in the anti-modern myth-making of history by means of a return to national symbols and myths, and occasionally through swapping conspiracy theories. Restorative nostalgia manifests itself in total reconstruction of monuments of the past, while reflective nostalgia lingers on ruins, the patina of time and history, in the dreams of another place and another time. Now, this is amazingly kind of prescient in some ways, given it was it 2001. I think we're all probably familiar with examples of the power of restorative nostalgia in the contemporary world, Brexit in the UK, nationalist rhetoric of America First, the project of Zemmour or Le Pen in France, Orban in Hungary. But reflective nostalgia is an interesting way in which to approach bookshops, I want to suggest, and particularly Whitman, shaped after the ruins of the Second World War, powered by the patina of pre-war modernist experimentation. Reflective nostalgia is a meditation on time and history, rather than a project to restore what is past. It is, argues Boehm, a project of individual and cultural memory, characterised by what she calls fragments, irony and humour. So I'm just going to try and explore whether this is how we understand Whitman's bookshop, a meditation upon the ruins of modernism. Is it an ironic recreation of a modernist bookshop for those that missed Beech's original? Now, for many people that visit Whitman's shop today, Beech's earlier iteration, also on the left bank but several streets away, is rather more sketchily remembered. Indeed, Beech's bookshop is often somewhat forgotten by those officially in charge of cultural memory in Paris, as there is only, I think this was taken a few years ago, but I don't think it's changed, a very small plaque above the current shop. And when I visited a few years ago, there was a big sale on there. So there was a very small plaque there for the Beech bookshop. Across the road was where Monier's shop was, and it was only in 2021 that a plaque was opened for Monier's bookshop. So I don't know what this is kind of tells us something about French views on nostalgia. Maybe also I need to look this up, whether, I always think of Pierre Nora's work on Lieu de Mémoire, that whether bookshops don't figure in these memory sites in Nora's work somehow. And sometimes the distinct nature of the two versions of Shakespeare and Company is completely missed or deliberately blurred. Here's a blurb for a kind of fun book by somebody called Jeremy Mercer's memoir of his time in Whitman's bookshop in the early 2000s. Shakespeare and Company in Paris is one of the world's most famous bookshops. Originally the haunt of literary greats such as Hemingway, Stein and Joyce, it later became the principal meeting place for beatnik poets. Today the tradition continues. So what we've got is an impression of unbroken continuity, that it is the same shop, but it isn't, So is this a hint of that restorative nostalgia here? I think it would be easy to view the later Shakespeare and Company as one that nostalgically desires to restore the cultural heritage of Beech's pioneering bookshop. However, I would suggest that we need to be careful of a simple binary that says the later one is inauthentic and the earlier one was the authentic modern bookshop. And yet the mood of nostalgic reconstruction or reflection, to use Boehm's terms, to an extent persists. Whitman was certainly prone to presenting his own bookshop as following in the tradition established by Beech and Monnier. So, for example, in 1966, Whitman's bookshop was closed down because he had never received a foreign businessman's license. And so he had to open it instead as what he called the Free University of Paris, and as a private library which was open by invitation to the public. Now, as part of the campaign to get it reopened, Whitman wrote to the French novelist André Malraux, who was then the French Minister for Culture in 1967. And in the letter which he published in one of his magazines, he says, since the deaths of Adrien Monnier and Sylvia Beech, the type of bookstore that welcomes young writers and bibliophiles and acts as a meeting place is in danger of disappearing. At Shakespeare and Company, I modestly try to maintain this tradition, which in the past contributed to the charm of Paris. So there is clearly a nostalgic appeal here to times past, to lost or disappearing bibliophile tradition. An urban nostalgia that seeks not only a return to the past, but also a desire to recover a lost space, or at least recover the mood of that earlier location, the charm of old Parisian bookstores as meeting places. Sometimes adverts for Whitman's bookshop also drew directly upon this mood of nostalgia, as in this advert from the late 50s, early 60s, where a quote from Thacker there is a really interesting one. I have a home in every land, but I don't know where it is, which suggests that the bookshop is the home or the nostos to which the literary voyager has always been travelling. The idea of a bookshop as a home recalls Monnier's theory of the bookshop as something magical, and the Belgian writer Henri Michaud, who visited Monnier's bookshop a lot, used a similar image to describe Monnier's own shop. He said, here is the homeland of those free spirits who have not found a homeland. So again, this sense of the nostalgia as the search for the nostos. I think it's probably worth stressing here, and given the image on the left there, and you can see quite specifically that for the first 13 years of its operation, Whitman ran an English language bookshop in Paris that was not called Shakespeare and Company. It was called Mistral Bookshop, or Librairie Mistral. On the occasion of the relaunch of Mistral as Shakespeare and Company in 1964, which was 2 years after Sylvia Beach's death, Whitman once again invoked the continuity of tradition. Beach, said Whitman, often told me that mine was the kind of bookstore she liked. She gave the impression that she thought of it as the spiritual successor to Shakespeare and Company. So here we have a kind of view of the early Mistral, and it's the same location that the current one is. So just as Beach's bookshop is often viewed in the nostalgic light of the lost generation of American writers of the 20s, so Whitman's bookstore connected with a later generation of American visitors to Paris. I live for the day, wrote Whitman in 1950, when I'll have a bookstore to embellish this workaday world. And once he arrived in Paris, he set about establishing it, set up a library, a lending library first of all. And then, of course, as I said, he opened Mistral in 1951 and started to hold literary events there, as well as workshops and seminars. There were book signings by James Baldwin, Lawrence Durrell, Richard Wright, followed by visitors from beat writers such as Gregory Corso and Allen Ginsberg. In 1958, and I don't have a photograph of this, Ginsberg gave a reading of Howl While Naked, following the example of Corso, who had already stripped off while reading his verse. Famously, the Mistral offered rooms for guests known as tumbleweeds, as long as the guests helped out in the shop. And this is a kind of tradition that picks up earlier ones in certain other bookshops. Harold Munro's poetry bookshop in London had a room that they rented out to poets that were passing through. And it's kind of a manifestation, I suppose, of Whitman's leftist sympathies. He was a CP member at one point, I think in the 30s. And he once claimed that Shakespeare and Company was really, quote, a socialist utopia masquerading as a bookstore. Now, Shakespeare and Company was never an outright radical bookshop. There are many of these. I mean, in London, I'm thinking, if you know them, of Houseman's Bookshop, which is still there. The kind of radical bookshops like Gay's The Word in London. There are a number of other kind of quite explicitly radical bookshops devoted to politics. But the notion of the bookshop as a kind of socialist utopia, or at least a progressive cultural space, is one that can be found in the visions of many booksellers and indicates another aspect of that reflective nostalgia. Bookshops are places which don't just look backwards within the pages of historical tomes. They promise change in the future. They foment new ideas in readers energised by what they read. Such views, I think, can be discerned in, again, Monnier's metaphysical idea of the bookshop as a magic chamber, in which interactions between bookseller and customer can selling of a mere commodity. Or Nancy's notion that bookshops are a space of opening towards the other, in which the emotional and subtle commerce of thinking never ceases. Now, one example of this commerce of thinking is how Whitman's shop reconstructed features associated with the earlier modernist bookshops by publishing little magazines and other forms of small press publications. So I'm going to just kind of work through those. And, of course, publishing little magazines was, again, another kind of often a non-commercial practice. They're never a venture intended to make money. Connoisseur value and perhaps use value are the order of the day with them. So after being open for only 1 year, Whitman's bookshop supported the publication of this literary journal, Merlin, in 1952. This was edited by the Scottish avant-garde writer Alexander Trocchi, along with an English poet, Christopher Logue, and an American Richard Seaver. It was financed by the American Jane Lugie. Shakespeare and Company provided space for the editors to work, along with an editorial address for the magazine and a venue for readings associated with it. The magazine, with its rather austere cover, ran for 7 issues and is perhaps best known for its promotion of Samuel Beckett, whose work in French was at that time little known in the Anglophone world. Here we've got an extract from What. They also published some stuff from Malloy and essays on Beckett. Now, though this was an Anglophone magazine in initial kind of origins, there were signs that the magazine, like the Bookshop too, was trying to connect to French cultural life as well as more widely and internationally, principally by publishing material in translation. A map from one issue of the magazine, I really like this map, positions the magazine geographically amidst the burgeoning intellectual life of Saint-Germain. You can see kind of cafes, bookshops and so on there. So Merlin published work by Ionesco, Svevo, Neruda. There was also an arrangement to reprint material in translation from Sartre's magazine Le Temps Moderne. And though one editorial described Merlin as an expatriate magazine, which echoes, of course, all of those magazines of the 20s and 30s that were stocked in Beach's bookshop, the Americans in Paris type magazines. By its 3rd issue, Merlin was employing a French subtitle, Revue trimestrielle, the quarterly review, and later planned to publish Alexander Kojève's article on Hegel and Marx, which is an important bit of kind of philosophical work in this period. So the magazine thus seemed to capture some of the uncertainties of a post-war avant-garde, trying to articulate a new voice after the decline of an earlier modernist moment, while also renewing a commitment to internationalism amongst contemporary writers and thinkers. As this advert claimed, it wanted to be a new force in European letters. And in some senses, this is this aspect of the reflective nostalgia, I think, pondering the effects of time and history upon the modernist project and thinking, well, what can we reactivate from that in this moment and a different moment? There are signs also in the early days that Shakespeare and Company Bookshop wanted to reinvigorate an international mood dampened by the conflict of war and operate something more than just an English language bookshop. So the following advert for the bookstore from Merlin indicates how the bookshop stocked and distributed many works of French literature for export. And the advert at the bottom shows that also you could do evening classes in the bookshop in Russian and Italian. Another advert for the bookshop on the opposite side promoted the bookshop as the Left Bank Art Centre, which offers a complete service to the students of contemporary life, combining the hospitable tradition of the Paris book salon, so again that idea of the meeting place, with a progressive documentation in psychoanalysis, sociology, literature and beaux-arts. I think this seems again closer to this reflective nostalgia, hoping to revive a progressive and internationalist modernist community. The second magazine promoted by Whitman's Bookshop continued this tradition, I think, this new tradition. It's a rather overlooked magazine called Two Cities, edited by Jean Fanchette, a black writer, critic, psychoanalyst from Mauritius. And it consists of 9 issues between 1959 and 64. Used again the bookshop as its editorial office. It was a bilingual review, which is interesting, and carried material by a wide range of contemporary writers, including William Burroughs, Henry Miller, Anais Nin, H.D., and so on, Richard Wright. International figures such as Octavia Paz and Fernando Pessoa were also published there. And a special issue, I find this really interesting, a special issue from 1960 commemorated the centenary of the birth of Rabindranath Tagore. Citing Beckett's ability to write in both French and English, Fanchette, in an editorial, offered the review as a way to overcome the divisions between English and French, promising also, quote, that a large part of the magazine will be kept for poetry in both languages and for experimental literature. Though the title was Two Cities, as we can see, I think, on the left here, the magazine's transnational aims were signalled by editorial teams in Paris, London and New York. So again, the focus on bilingualism, on translation, speaks to Nancy's notion of the bookshop as a crucial space for the opening of thought towards the other. The final magazine to appear from Shakespeare and Company was the Paris magazine, edited by Whitman himself, who jokingly called it the poor man's Paris Review. And of course, unlike the Paris Review, it received no funding from the CIA, but that's a different story. A first issue appeared in 1967, which you see here, with only a few more issues appearing sporadically over the next decades. This is a very irregular publication, we might say, in terms of its periodicity. In this first issue, we have pieces on Durrell, Ginsberg, small presses, continuing the vein of earlier magazines, as is the interview in French with novelist Marguerite Duras. But what marks the magazine as different is the focus upon contemporary politics. There's reflections on Malcolm X, a report on the famous Dialectics of Liberation Congress held in London earlier that year. And particularly striking, I think, is this 4-page photo essay on the war in Vietnam, with text supplied by Sartre. It also has some very bad proofreading, as you can see with how Vietnam is presented here. So a list of events at the bookshop in May 1967 includes a discussion on the war in Vietnam, a Black Power poetry reading. It's strangely, the magazine was not, in some senses, overtly political, though it got a lot of political content. I mean, Whitman flippantly said what he wanted to do was just achieve a little humour and explore the universe together in the magazine. But I do think the mood of the times, the radical politics of the mid to late 60s, and its internationalism really marked this magazine, and also marked the kind of radical transformations that the world was going through, but also the bookshop is registering. An advert for the bookshop in the magazine promotes it, so this is 1967, as a location for those who cherish freedom, practice equality, and seek justice. In hoping to present itself as a book-lined apartment on the Seine, not private, but a shared space, we see again something of Whitman's utopian vision. But also, I think, echoing Monnier's vision of the bookshop as a space of community. Now, just to kind of bring this together and conclude. In 1958, Beach attended a dinner party in Whitman's Mistral bookshop and was reported to say that she would offer the name of Shakespeare and Company to her fellow American. Though it took 6 more years before the name changed, the move from this owner to that, to remember the quote from Ulysses, gave Whitman the feeling that his revival of Beach's Modernist bookshop had a certain cultural legitimacy. However, in its early manifestations, Whitman's shop exhibited an internationalist outlook that connected with certain tendencies within pre-war modernism, but also acknowledged the new conditions of the post-war world, and to extent became a meeting space for a community committed to cultural politics. The mood of the bookshop and its magazines seems to capture the radical questioning of that earlier moment in the history of modernism. We might say then that Whitman's shop nostalgically reflected upon an earlier modernist moment, aware of the ruins brought to its culture by the war, and showed in its recreation of the earlier bookshop what Boyne calls that patina of time and history. George Whitman died in 2011, and the bookshop is now run by his daughter, Sylvia. Named, of course, in homage to Sylvia Beach. Now, is this bookshop today more liable to be accused of trading in nostalgia? Well, I don't really have time to explore that today, but I think we might note that possibly all small independent bookshops today are intrinsically bound up with a certain mood of nostalgia in a retail world dominated by the online empire of Amazon. Thus, to accuse Shakespeare and Company today of trading on the nostalgic recreation of a modernist bookshop is only to acknowledge the seemingly belated quality of all visits to the bookshop today. And reflective nostalgia, as Boyne reminds us, has a utopian element. In presenting itself as an archaic space for selling books in a contemporary moment seemingly devoted to online retail, A bricks and mortar bookshop such as Shakespeare and Company might be an instance of what Ernst Bloch in his work on utopias called a non-synchronous present, in which lastingly subversive and utopian contents from the past live on in the present because they anticipate an emancipated future yet to materialise. So perhaps when we now visit such seemingly belated modernist structures, what we are purchasing is not just a book, if we do that at all, but experiencing a particular mood, part wistful, part wish fulfillment, part defiance against online capitalism, a mood that might give us pleasure and possibly reflects to a more reflective use of nostalgia. And in doing so, I think we continue that commerce of thinking with books began by Monnier in the early years of the 20th century. A love for the spirit of what is new is thus an ongoing process in houses devoted to books. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this wonderful travel in time and space and places that are familiar to many of us. We bought a long time ago the dial from that place,
Yeah.
and now we're trying to find it among the rubble of moving universities. All of this is so much of a reminder of a lifestyle and commitment to a way of approaching the world and restructuring it. I particularly loved your conclusion with this nudge towards its sort of anti-capitalistic stance and resistance that endures. I'm sure I've got questions, and obviously, but I'd like to leave time for our friends to ask questions. Yes, Benoit. Please wait for the mic because we are recording this and your questions will need to be.
All right. Thank you very much for a very evocative talk. I think you really captured the gist of this very special place in Paris, which is a very ambivalent, ambiguous space as well, you know. And today I think it kind of trades on nostalgia a lot more than it used to have special shelves for, you know, lost generations, Americans in Paris, Hemingway, and it really caters to young American tourists who come to Paris in a much more blatant way than it used to when it was George himself running the place. I have just two questions, if I may. One has to do with the exchanges between Monnier and Beach. They're often described as partners, but then they tend to be considered separately. One, Monnier, being very much part of the history of surrealism and French avant-garde, and Beach, of course, tied to Joyce. So I was wondering if there were actually beyond their personal relationships and the work they made, for example, translating Eliot, if there were sort of exchanges of books also that, you know, they might have sold each other's stock or exchanged their customers or lent to the same people or, you know, had some communal practices of this kind. That would be my first question. And the second one has to do, I think you, at the end, you alluded to the fact that Sylvia Beach may have accepted, you know, giving the name of the bookshop. Still, it happened 2 years after her death, and it's always been kind of a dark area and a sort of suspicious one as far as I'm concerned. I'm never quite sure how the transition was effected, and so I don't know if you have any more specific data or evidence as to how that might have happened. What blessing did she actually give or not give to George? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Benoit. Yeah, just on the first question then. I think it's one of the interesting things that very much they should be seen together, Monnier and Beach, as bookshops. I mean, they quite often. I think one of them said, "Oh, there should be a tunnel under Rue de l'Odeon," so that connected them. I mean, one kind of concrete example is that the subscribers to the two libraries, if you subscribe to one, you got a discount if you also subscribe to the other. And as I said, the borrowers' cards that you can see for Lacan, de Beauvoir, and Benjamin. You can see those for Sylvia Beach, but they were also borrowers at Monnier. So I think there was that kind of, oh, you like this book, you might bookshop, you might like this one just across the road kind of thing. I think they also collaborated in terms of a number of the events. I mean, the famous Larbo talk and then the translation, and the talk is in the La Maison, but, it's also linked very much to the ongoing publicity for Ulysses. So I think it's probably one of the problems about as you said, the divisions between Sea and Beach with it solely through the kind of lens of the Americans in Paris, and not acknowledging that Monnier was there. And Monnier was there first and had got the concept of the bookstore that was also a lending library. And also to stock modern books, which was new, I think, in Paris bookselling at the time. But also the kind of decor. I mean, I alluded to that. And from what I can work out, Monnier's also, I mean, Beach's very famous ones where you've got all those photographs of the writers that she's stocking. But also, if you look at images from Monnier's, you also have that. So it's that kind of, you're surrounded by the same kind of interior space. So I think, they should be interconnected much more. The second point, it is still a little bit of a dark area. I mean, that quote I read out from Whitman. Whitman's kind of saying, "Oh, she gave me her blessing," but then it takes another 6 years before after her death. So there's nothing I've found in the Beach archives I've looked at to indicate. Absolutely, she said, this guy can take over this. She obviously resisted for quite a while, so we opened this other one for 13 years. And I've not been able to yet access the whatever archives there are in the current one. There may be an answer there. Whitman himself, that quote seems to say, she said that was fine, but it is still a bit of a grey area, so it's kind of interesting to prod away at that a little bit more, I think. Thanks. There's one there and one there.
Yes.
Hi. Is the microphone on? Andrew, this wonderful talk. It was really great hearing all about these different kind of bookshops. And it got me thinking about two things. One is that, bookshops originally were publishers, right? And in the Modernist period, you have a little bit of continuation of that, like Shakespeare and Company. But then also, like in the 50s, Pound has some of his acolytes build this kind of bookshop for him called Make It New, and it's part of the Square Dollar series, which is also a publisher. So the bookshop also becomes a creator of books as well in the kind of period, which is, I think, it continues, this happened in the Enlightenment, right? Like, Amsterdam-based, whatever. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that I was wondering a bit, if you could speak about the bookshop as a kind of legal entity, navigating things like censorship. Because, of course, censorship law, the onus was based on, those who distribute work, not necessarily those who produce the work. Right, so it was the bookshop that was the one that was targeted. I don't know if you have anything to say about that particular aspect.
Yeah, thank you. You must tell me where the Pound bookshop Make It New is. Yeah, where that is. Just in the first one, publishers as bookshops, bookshops as publishers. My sense is that at the end of the 19th century, you start to get that being stressed more. So Elkin Matthews, who I mentioned, publishes Pound and Joyce first of all. They're the first publisher of that. Harold Munro publishes a lot of stuff. Poetry Bookshop publishes Des Imagistes and so on. So it becomes a kind of very closely linked in a number of these bookshops to the idea of the small press. I mean, Ferlinghetti, he's big friends with Whitman. When he goes to San Francisco, he's got an idea to run a similar kind of entity. And one of the first things he does is starts a magazine, and then he starts, publishing the little kind of bookshop, lunch poems by Frank O'Hara and so on. So I think it's absolutely integral to the vision of what I call the modern bookshop. And what I'm using is something that's committed to publishing, to being a space for interactions. They can't be separated from, bigger bookstores and chain bookstores, but it's a complex story, and I can't tell the history of everything. Just in terms of the legal entity and the idea of censorship, absolutely fascinating. And the only thing I can say is I refer you to a forthcoming article I've got on the bookshop and censorship in modernism and modernity on this very topic. Because, really interesting that booksellers became targeted, particularly, for example, in London, but also in New York. Frances Stelloff was taken to court for publishing Boccaccio's The Decameron, and she's, and a couple of other books, and so that was a famous case in the 50s. So they become targeted at various points, and obviously with City Lights, the Howell trial of Ginsberg is a key one in terms of legal changes. So it's a kind of interesting moment that you can see the particular legal structures in different countries interact with the bookshops in different way, and then that's obviously the story of why Ulysses is published in Paris, because Joyce can't get it published in New York. After the trial of the Little Review for publishing extracts from Ulysses, he says, I'm never going to get this published in New York or in London. Says this alleged, this is one of these stories that's got multiple interpretations, but he allegedly goes into Beech's bookstore and said, I'm never going to get Ulysses published. And she says, can I publish it? And she's never published anything before in her life. So, but that's because the French laws around censorship were much more liberal from the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. Particularly, you got the development of something called French editions, which were editions of pornographic books that booksellers in London couldn't sell in London, but they could sell them in France because the laws were like, you can publish what you want, there's a whole series, and my article might make some of it clearer.
And D.H. Lawrence and Lady Chatterley's Lover, that's one famous example.
Yeah. And like you see, Lawrence came in and got friends to go into Beech's bookshop and said, after publishing Ulysses, would she publish Lady Chatterley in an edition? And Beech is very ambivalent about this. And one reason was because, she wasn't a publisher, and it was an enormous drain upon her to publish Ulysses in all sorts of ways, financially, supporting this awkward Irish writer who was very demanding. So she didn't want to keep, more and more of these people. But I think it was also that sense she didn't want to get a reputation for publishing dirty books. She wanted to be what she was, publishing kind of modern literature, but she didn't want that kind of thing. So, didn't go down that route.
Yes, no?
Thank you very much for this really wonderful talk. I just wanted to go back briefly to what Benoit started asking about the transmission between Sylvia Beech and George Whitman. I actually spent a year working in Shakespeare and Company about a decade ago while George was still alive, and indeed there was this gray zone about whether she gave him his permission to open the bookstore. But in fact, I think there's, it's part of his own personality and strategy of kind of appropriating aspects of the past. There was also this mythology about whether or not he was a descendant of Walt Whitman or not, and that's equally, I think, his own kind of attempt to recuperate the past and forge a kind of trans-historical structure where he becomes a kind of second Walt Whitman or something. So I was wondering what you think about that, about this idea, even naming his daughter. He's not she's not only called Sylvia Whitman, it's Sylvia Beech Whitman. So there's something about this kind of trying to precisely restore the past, as you know, you mentioned this idea of restorative nostalgia. Do you see that as problematic in any way, or do you think it's a useful way of creating new structures?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'd love to talk to you more about your experience of working there as well. Yeah, I do think it's restorative, and I suppose when the Boehm distinction I found useful, because I was trying to think about nostalgia and thinking, well, is it always a bad thing? I was thinking, Benjamin is a great example of, nostalgia can be positive, there can be progressive elements within it, and the Boehm kind of picked that up and did something else with it. I think, as you said, there are perhaps much more today. That bookshop is probably just as Benoit said, is trading on some of that, very much so. And I suppose one key thing is how much it interacts with what is happening in French publishing and international publishing, rather than just being, oh, this is where you can buy Hemingway. Oh, isn't it great? You can buy Hemingway in this shop. And Hemingway hung out in this shop. Well, he didn't, because it was in a different place. But, the narrative gives you that kind of, oh, I'm reaching into that past. So, yeah, that's the element of the restorative. And I suppose maybe the restorative nostalgia might also always be, reflective nostalgia might be something that could be recuperated into a restorative one, so it tips over back into, oh, it's just a kind of recreation of the past. I suppose the other thing you need to talk about, somebody talked about the ambivalence of bookshops, and I made a big thing of saying that they're places where not just selling commodities happens, but they are places that sell commodities. They have to be, because they are businesses. So debates around value in bookstores, I think, are really interesting, because quite often booksellers will think that they are, and will say to you that they're doing more than selling you, just other stuff. A bookseller in Hay-on-Wye, the book town in Wales, I was chatting to, he said, oh, I get a different feeling when I sell a first edition of Dickens. It's not like selling a tin of beans, he said. But at one level, they're both commodities. Yeah. So it's both. It's really kind of got that ambivalent structure to it, I think. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your really fascinating lecture. Can you tell me more about Walter Benjamin, and about his role, because he was critic of modernism, at the same time part of the modernist movement. He was a very strange person, destructive character. Is one of his essays, and we can say that his character is something like that. Thank you.
I can tell you just a little bit about Benjamin and the two bookshops, really. To say much more would take a long while, and I'm not that much of a Benjamin scholar. But he was obviously working in Paris on the Arcades project, and then I think he joined the Monnier bookshop first of all, became very good friends with Monnier, and also other people that were associated with it. Breyer was very good friends with Monnier and Beach, and became friends with Benjamin. And I think they did a bit of translation work together, which was really interesting. I think Benjamin found, he's got a great essay that you might know called Unpacking My Library, which is all about going to visit bookshops and buying them, and what buying having a book that you remember where you bought it from brings back the flavour of the city there. So again, it's a kind of nostalgia, but it's mood and so on. And I suppose for Benjamin, those kind of bookstores are kind of places where, there's elements of a critique of capitalism, a critique of modernity in some way that is there. The borrowing card that he has for Sylvia Beach one is quite a melancholy one, because it's very late, it's 1939. The story of Benjamin after that is trying to escape, the kind of Nazis, and then, in the Pyrenees where he commits suicide. But the borrower's card, which you can see online, one of the books, I forget, one of the books he borrows is a German-English dictionary. because he was in contact with Adorno or Horkheimer in the States and trying to arrange passage. And his English wasn't as good as his French, and he was hoping to brush up on his English, hoping that he was going to end up there. So it's kind of melancholy little moment. So, yeah.
Thank you. Do you hear me? I just don't hear it. Thank you for a really fascinating talk.
Thank you.
I have all these ideas going through my head, especially books as sort of affective objects, that we share and we trade, that move from person to person. And so my question goes back to the first thing you said. You didn't really have time to talk about the materiality of the bookshops. And I'm hoping you might say something about them as containing spaces, or the materiality of what it was like, or how they conceived the shop itself as a space.
Yeah, great. It is a really fascinating topic. That so far with these two, it's difficult. With the Beach and Monnier, obviously the current Shakespeare and Company, you can just walk around it. The other two, it would be great to get a floor plan of what they were like, but I've never seen that anywhere, not in any of the archives for Beach, maybe some for Monnier. So I'm relying on the kind of photographic evidence that you have. So some of the the images I showed there with the jump back with the people sitting behind desks and photos. I mean, so this is this is still very much like the current Shakespeare and Company Whitman there. But I'll jump back. I had one. Yeah, so you get that kind of, hang on, it's that one, isn't it? That's Beach in her bookshop, where you get the images of all the photographs there and the books, and there's a little bust of Shakespeare there as well. So I do think there is a kind of particular look that booksellers were recreating. One of the most interesting ones I have found information about is one called the Sunwise Turn, which was a New York bookshop from the 1910s. And they advertised themselves as the Sunwise Turn, a modern bookshop. And by modern, they glossed it as use of things like windows. They wanted particular window space so you could see into them. It's also about the way books are displayed. I mean, people who work in bookshops, are often taught how to display books in particular ways, to make them, accessible, or, the ones that they want to push at the front. These ones look a bit more haphazard, but that's part of the charm, I suppose, and it's part of the look of, it's a modern bookshop. It's kind of, I suppose today we think about, this is what kind of antiquarian bookshops are a little bit like. The one I went in to buy these two today, the guy was getting his step ladder out because I was trying to say, I'm looking for these. I think I may have some up here somewhere. So there is that kind of sense. And I think that the current Shakespeare and Company very much trades on that. If you go around it, there's like a typewriter somewhere that you can type a little message or poem on. There's sofas and so on. So I think, again, the interior is to create a mood, an effective space in which to shop. And, I've looked at a number of contemporary bookshops, all sorts of places, and found them really interesting just in terms of what they're trying to do. There's a great one in Los Angeles, the Last Bookstore, where they make kind of displays. So the desk is kind of made of books resting on it, and there's a book arch as well. So, but the stock isn't great. So that's the kind of interesting. It's like a nice space, but actually you can't find very interesting books in it. So sometimes it's it's the experience of being in the space rather than, you've got a great stock. Yeah. Thanks.
Can I ask a question? Two questions, actually. Did I hear you say correctly that you worked at Shakespeare and Company?
No, Jasna did.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
So I won't worry about this next question then. I thought, I'm asking a question about the competitor. Have you heard about Village Voice, the Village Voice, which you didn't speak about now? I'm sure it's outside of the time range. It's just a question because I think it has a spirit that is also an important spirit, but it's now closed. So I have nostalgia for that particular place.
Yeah. I mean, it's not. It was something I knew about, and then I saw that it closed. I remember seeing the owner putting out kind of adverts saying, "Please come in and buy a book," because I haven't sold one for a week, and I'm running out of money and that kind of thing. And I suppose that's the kind of, I've been doing this project for a while, and when it must have started, somebody said to me, "Oh, it's a good project because bookshops are going to disappear. They're just going to be eradicated because of Amazon." And, A Books, if you buy stuff from A Books, that's owned by Amazon, so that's the second-hand bookseller aggregated network for all the independent ones, so they've taken that over. But what you look at, if you look at the retail figures, is there was a kind of decline, and, reading stuff on a Kindle, that was going up, and but then it kind of stayed. There was a point about 4 or 5 years ago, it stabilised in the UK and also in the US. And the France is very different because you have laws protecting the price structure. They can't be discounted as much as in Britain and America. So it kind of stopped. And the other thing, and going back to the question you were asking, was one of the things I suppose that's happened in retail in a lot of kind of big cities is the rise of that kind of independent sellers of, secondhand clothing, craft beer, cafes, coffee, and bookshops are part of that kind of artisanal shopping phenomena that we had. So that's kind of stabilised, and you look at sellers of independent bookstores. The Booksellers Association in America has started saying a couple of years ago, bookshops are no longer an endangered species. They're kind of just slowly on the uptick. So that's kind of interesting as a phenomenon, I think. Top there.
Yes, thank you for a really interesting talk. I was wondering, the functions of the space that you laid out are somewhat similar to the model of public sphere in Habermas, but also not, right? These are private spaces that tend to cater to a smaller coterie of people. They're not about cultivating normative, civil discourse, but about vanguard cultural politics. So I wondered if you could tell us or talk to us a little bit more about the public-private status of modern bookstores, how you see their relationship to the state, and specifically the financing of these spaces, right? On the one hand, they're anti-capitalistic in that they're independently owned, but that also assumes some level of independent wealth on the part of the owners. So yeah, just if you think about private, public nature of these spaces.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's a really important and interesting kind of topic there. I mean, I wrote something again on this related to Monier and about the kind of public space of it, because she has the essay where she talks about the bookshop as a magic chamber. It starts with an image of somebody coming in off the street, a member of the public, and then becoming somebody that you form a relationship to. So, they're not quite the public space. They're not the cafes of Habermas that we're discussed, but they're somewhat similar because they are open to anybody that can go into them. And I suppose the ones where you get bookstores that say, we're going to have a reading, anybody can come that can get a ticket, is, that's open. You don't have to even buy a book. And I think, they're not private spaces, clearly. They're not quite, the public space in Habermas's conception, but they fulfill some of the role of, enabling discourse, enabling a meeting place, that term, the function of a promotion of a community, the community of like-minded readers. In terms of ownership, I mean, there are bookstores that are owned cooperatively still, some. there's when I work in Nottingham, there's a great kind of little independent bookstore which is called Five Leaves, which is a very radical one, stocks a lot of leftist magazines, pamphlets, but also promotes poetry a lot. You do need wealth to open a bookstore, but I guess you need wealth to open any kind of private enterprise in that way. None of them really make a great deal of money from it, from what I can make out talking to them. And as I said, the guy that said, "Oh, it's like it's not selling a tin of beans." they get something from the interaction, and very much the interaction with the customers. And that's one of the things that you get that you can't get from online stuff. The experience of browsing is really interesting, isn't it? Because actually one of the things you can do is in a bookshop, you can browse, you can try things, you can stand there and read the stuff, and then you don't have to buy it. And somebody said, can't really imagine doing that in many places. You can't, try out your tin of beans and say, "I don't like this, I'm sending it back now." But the ambiguous space of the bookshop is a really interesting point. So thanks for raising it again.
Thank you, Professor Thacker, for that wonderful talk, which makes me think that what I'm going to say is perhaps naive, but I don't know, and a little outside the ambit of your talk as well, perhaps. But I was just picking up from what Sue said about the public-private. I was thinking of the interplay between the public bookshop and the private bookshelf. I recently read Amitav Ghosh's essay. It's called The Testimony of My Grandfather's Bookcase. And it's an interesting essay because he begins with talking about how when he's growing up, the bookshelf at home is an oratic locale for him. And it represents a spectacle of cosmopolitanism for him. And then the halo begins to dent. So I was also thinking, because you use the category of nostalgia, I was also thinking about how bookcases are often, especially if you're thinking of the private bookshelf, are often catalyzers of disaffiliation, not just affiliation, but perhaps also spaces from where disaffiliation begins. So
that's really interesting, thinking about the relation to the bookshelf, as it rather than the bookshop or the library shelf. I think I probably just picking up on this public-private again. I was picking up the fact that all of these bookshops, apart from the recent Shakespeare Company, were also libraries, and that's a very different public-private relationship, isn't it? Because anybody, you may be, I can't afford this, but I can afford to borrow, perhaps. So the relationship to finding the book on the bookshelf, I think, is really interesting. But disaffiliation, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, but I'd like someone. You must tell me where the Amitav Ghosh essay occurs. But just picking up the library as a different kind of experience.
I was thinking, for example, you know Rees better than me, certainly, but I was thinking of Rees's short story, for example, The Day They Burned the Books.
Oh, yes,
so
yes.
I think that my word came from...
Yeah.
Or a lot of women writers who would use the bookshelf as a point of departure.
Yeah. So. Well, that's why that Woolf quote was really interesting, because it's ours in a library. But the library, I think, is a father's library. And so we get into all the debates about she was unable to go to university. Her university education was Leslie Stephen's library, which was at home. So, but it was ambivalent for her because it's her father's words, not the words of the younger generation. So that might be an example of that disaffiliation, the kind of feeling. Learning from it. For Woolf, it's reading Hakluyt and all these kind of wonderful things, but also feeling kind of somewhat distant. It's not, these books are not what I want to say. I want to read other stuff. So I thought it's a really interesting kind of quote from Woolf. But, just going back to this kind of difference in a library and a bookshop, I think they're really interested in these shops that have them, and I think about my own experience really. When somebody once asked me, "Why are you interested in bookshops?" and did you work in one? No. Did you use one a lot when I was young? I said no, because my family didn't have much money for books, but we had a library at the bottom of the road. So my interest in English literature was the fact I could browse through this public library and just pull stuff off and think, oh, never heard of that one. I'll try that one this week. So, and that's kind of the what you're getting at, but. For me, it was a space of opening into a world that wasn't at home in some way. I don't know if there's somebody up there if you want to keep going, or maybe finish.
Shall we adjourn to lunch and pursue more of this lovely conversation? Thank you so much, Andrew. This was magnificent.
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you for the great questions as well. That's really good.
We're so much looking forward to the book about the bookshop that we can browse and read.